The Boston winter had just started to settle in, painting the world outside my bedroom window in shades of gray and white. I remember that day with a clarity that still makes my chest tighten. November 17th, a Tuesday that would forever mark the before and after in my life. I was hunched over my laptop at my desk, frantically trying to finish a paper for Professor Harrington's literature class at Branton Community College. The room around me was my sanctuary, walls covered with indie band posters, fairy lights casting a warm glow, and books stacked precariously on every surface. This small corner of our suburban home was the only place I truly felt like myself. The door flew open with such force that it slammed against the wall, the sound making me jump in my seat. Mom stood there, her face contorted with an anger I rarely saw, a laundry basket clutched in her white-knuckled grip. Dad loomed behind her, his tall frame filling the doorway, his usually kind eyes now hard as flint. "Is this what we're paying for? So you can live like a slob?" Mom's voice cut through the quiet of my room as she hurled a handful of my dirty clothes at me. They landed on my keyboard, my half-finished essay disappearing beneath a pile of wrinkled t-shirts and jeans. "Sarah, we've had enough," Dad added, his voice deceptively calm but laced with disappointment that felt like acid on my skin. "Your sister never gave us this kind of trouble. Jessica had a full scholarship by now. She had a plan." There it was again, the comparison that had shadowed me my entire life. Jessica, the golden child, now finishing her medical residency at Mass General, her life a perfect blueprint of success that I was expected to follow. "I'm working as hard as I can," I said, my voice barely audible as I tried to salvage my laptop from beneath the clothes. "I'm not Jessica. I never will be." "That's obvious," Mom snapped, dropping the laundry basket on the floor with a thud that seemed to punctuate her disgust. "You're 22 years old, Sarah. You're taking classes at a community college that aren't even going to lead to a real degree. You're working part-time at a coffee shop when you could be what?" The words escaped me before I could stop them. Years of pent-up frustration suddenly bubbling to the surface. Following the life path you've decided is the only acceptable one? Dad stepped further into the room, his gaze sweeping over the mess of papers, art supplies, and coffee mugs that cluttered my space. "We've given you everything, Sarah. A roof over your head, food, the chance to go to college. And this is how you repay us? By throwing it all away on what poetry and those little paintings you do." My illustrations weren't little paintings, they were my passion, my way of processing the world. I'd even started selling a few pieces online, something I'd been too afraid to tell them about because I knew they'd dismiss it as a hobby, not a potential career. "You've been coddled too long," Mom continued, her words hitting like physical blows. Jessica was independent by her age. She didn't need us to support her while she found herself. The air quotes she made around those last words felt like a mockery of everything I was trying to build. "I've never asked to be coddled," I replied, feeling something break inside me. "I've been trying to figure out my own path, not just follow someone else's." "Your own path?" Dad laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Your path is leading nowhere, Sarah. You're wasting your potential, wasting our money, wasting your life." Each accusation landed like a stone, heavy and cold. I looked at their faces, really looked, and saw no understanding there, no willingness to see me as anything other than a disappointment. In that moment, the revelation washed over me with startling clarity. I was being compared to a standard I could never meet because it wasn't mine to begin with. "Maybe I should just leave then," I said quietly, the words hanging in the air between us. I expected them to backtrack, to soften. Instead, Dad's expression hardened further. "Maybe you should. Maybe it's time you learned what the real world is like without us paying your way." Mom didn't contradict him. She just stood there, arms crossed, a wall of disapproval that I could no longer breach. It was as if they were looking at a stranger, not their daughter. The silence that followed was suffocating. I fought back the tears that threatened to spill, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. Instead, I turned back to my laptop, fingers hovering over the keyboard though I couldn't remember what I'd been writing about just minutes before. "We're done enabling this behavior," Mom finally said, her tone flat. "Either you start taking your life seriously, get a full-time job, transfer to a real university, process the enormity of what had just happened. The walls of my room, once a haven, now felt like they were closing in, squeezing the air from my lungs. I picked up one of the t-shirts Mom had thrown at me, a faded blue one from a concert I'd gone to with my best friend, Zoe, last summer. Clutching it to my chest, I finally let the tears come, silent sobs that shook my body as night fell outside my window. Hours passed as I sat there, replaying their words, feeling the weight of their disappointment crushing me. But as the initial shock began to fade, something else emerged from beneath the hurt, a quiet, burning resolve. For years, I'd been trying to carve out a place for myself in their narrow vision of success. I'd compromised, justified, and explained my choices, always with the desperate hope of gaining their approval. But in one brutal exchange, they'd made it clear that nothing I did would ever be enough unless I became someone I wasn't. I wiped my tears away with the sleeve of my sweater, a strange calm settling over me. If they couldn't see my worth, perhaps it was time I found people who could. The thought was terrifying and liberating all at once, a life without their support, but also without their judgment. The house grew quiet around me as the night deepened. Through my bedroom wall, I could hear the muffled sounds of the evening news and the occasional clink of glasses from the kitchen where my parents were probably discussing my future, or lack thereof, over glasses of Merlot. For them, it was just another Tuesday evening. For me, it was the night everything changed. I opened my closet and pulled out my old duffel bag from the top shelf, the one I'd used for summer trips to Cape Cod with my high school friends. It seemed like a lifetime ago now, those carefree days when the biggest decision was which beach to visit or which ice cream flavor to choose from Captain Frosty's. My hands trembled as I began to sort through my belongings, trying to determine what constituted a necessity in this new, uncertain future I was stepping into. Each item I selected felt weighted with significance. My worn copy of The Bell Jar, dog-eared and annotated, went in first, a token of comfort in its familiar pages. Next came my sketchbooks and favorite drawing pens, tools of the passion my parents had dismissed so easily. Clothes were more practical decisions, jeans, t-shirts, sweaters for the New England winter, all rolled tightly to save space. I grabbed my toiletries from the bathroom, moving quietly past my parents' closed door, heart pounding with every creak of the old hardwood floors. Back in my room, I stared at the framed family photo on my nightstand, the four of us at Jessica's medical school graduation, all smiles and pride. I couldn't bring myself to pack it, but I couldn't leave it behind either. I removed the photo from the frame and folded it carefully, tucking it into the inner pocket of my duffel bag, a reminder of what once was. My laptop, chargers, and the small amount of cash I'd been saving for my barista job at Groundworks Coffee went into my backpack, along with my phone and important documents. I hesitated over my credit card, the one linked to the account my parents had set up for me when I started college. Using it would leave a trail, and I wasn't sure I wanted to be found. After a moment's contemplation, I left it on the desk. As I moved around my room, selecting and discarding items with the strange detachment that comes with shock, I caught sight of myself in the mirror. The girl who stared back looked both familiar and foreign, same hazel eyes and unruly brown hair, but there was something different in her expression, a hardness that hadn't been there this morning. I wondered if this was what growing up really meant, not graduations or careers or marriages, but the moment you realize you must save yourself because no one else will. By midnight, my duffel bag and backpack were packed and waiting by the window. I sat at my desk and wrote a note, though the words came reluctantly. What do you say to people who have made it clear they would rather you be someone else? I'm taking your advice. I'm leaving to figure things out on my own. Don't worry about me. Sarah, short, direct, emotionless. I placed it on my pillow where they would find it in the morning. Then I opened my laptop one last time and sent a quick message to Zoe. Need a place to crash for a few days. Long story. Can I come over? Her reply came almost immediately. Doors unlocked. Got the couch ready for you. Whatever you need. Relief washed over me. At least I had somewhere to go for the night, a temporary sanctuary while I figured out my next steps. Zoe's tiny apartment in Somerville wasn't much, but it was a starting point. I shouldered my backpack, picked up my duffel bag, and took one last look around the room that had been mine since childhood. The posters on the walls, the stack of books beside the bed, the fairy lights that made everything feel magical, all of it would remain, physical remnants of the person I was leaving behind. Moving silently through the darkened house, I felt like a ghost, witnessing the last moments of my old life, but no longer part of it. The family photos that lined the hallway seemed to watch me pass, frozen smiles judging my decision. In the kitchen, I paused to take my house key off my keyring and place it on the counter, a small, symbolic act of finality. The November air hit me like a physical force as I slipped out the side door, sharp with the promise of snow. My breath clouded in front of me as I made my way down our driveway and out onto Maple Street. The neighborhood was asleep, windows dark, the only sound the soft rustling of fallen leaves beneath my feet. I walked 3 blocks to the 24-hour CVS where I could catch the last bus into the city. Sitting at the deserted bus stop, duffel bag between my feet, I felt a curious mix of terror and exhilaration. For the first time in my life, no one had expectations for my future. No one was waiting for me to fail. No one was comparing me to Jessica. The thought was both liberating and paralyzing. The bus arrived with a squeal of brakes and a hiss of hydraulics, its interior fluorescent lights harsh against the dark street. The driver, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, barely glanced at me as I paid my fare and found a seat near the back. As we pulled away from the curb, I watched my neighborhood, the only home I'd ever known, recede into the distance. The familiar streets and houses blurred together until they disappeared entirely, replaced by the commercial strips and apartment buildings that line the route into Boston. I leaned my head against the cool window and tried to anticipate what came next. Zoe's couch would be comfortable enough for a few days, maybe a week if I was lucky, but then what? My part-time job wouldn't cover rent anywhere in the city. I had some savings, but not enough to sustain me for long. Would I need to drop my classes? Find full-time work? The questions tumbled through my mind, each one spawning a dozen more, until they became a deafening chorus of uncertainty. Somewhere amid that chaos of worry, a small voice of reason emerged. One step at a time, it counseled. Tonight, find safety. Tomorrow, make a plan. The day after, begin to implement it. There was wisdom in that simplicity, and I clung to it like a lifeline. The city skyline appeared on the horizon, a constellation of lights against the night sky. Boston had always been my escape, a place where I could blend into the crowds, lose myself in art galleries and bookstores, become whoever I wanted to be for a few hours. Now it would become my haven in a more permanent way. By the time the bus reached Somerville, a light snow had begun to fall, dusting the streets and parked cars with a thin layer of white. I walked the 5 blocks to Zoe's apartment building, the weight of my bags growing heavier with each step, but my resolve strengthening in equal measure. Zoe was waiting at her door when I arrived, her round face creased with concern. She took my duffel bag without a word and pulled me into a fierce hug that nearly broke the fragile composure I had maintained throughout the journey. "You look like hell," she said finally, leading me inside the warm apartment that smelled of instant noodles and the essential oils she was always diffusing. "Feel like it too," I admitted, dropping my backpack and collapsing onto her secondhand couch, which had already been made up with sheets and a blanket. "Want to talk about it?" I shook my head, not ready to put the day's events into words. "Tomorrow, maybe. Right now I just need to sleep." She nodded, understanding without explanation, one of the reasons we'd remained friends since freshman orientation 4 years ago. "There's leftover Thai in the fridge if you're hungry. Bathroom's all yours. I've got an early shift at the hospital." After she retreated to her bedroom, I lay awake on the couch, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of her apartment building, pipes clinking, neighbors moving about, the distant wail of a siren. Despite my exhaustion, sleep eluded me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my parents' faces, heard their cutting words. Dawn arrived with the muted glow of winter sunlight filtering through Zoe's thin curtains. I'd barely slept, drifting in and out of consciousness as my mind refused to quiet. The reality of my situation settled over me like the blanket I'd pulled to my chin sometime in the night. I was essentially homeless, with limited funds knowledge that I was now adrift. I showered quickly, dressed in yesterday's clothes, and made myself a cup of coffee in one of Zoe's mismatched mugs. Sitting at her small kitchen table, I opened my laptop and began to assess my situation with the cold logic of necessity. My bank account held $1,247.32, the accumulated tips and minimum wage for months of serving lattes and pastries. My next shift at Groundworks wasn't until Friday, which meant I had 2 days to decide whether I could continue working there or needed to find something closer to wherever I ended up living. The fall semester had 6 weeks remaining, with finals looming just after Thanksgiving. Dropping out mid-semester would mean losing the credits I'd worked for, but staying enrolled meant finding a way to attend classes and complete assignments while restructuring my entire life. The enormity of it all threatened to overwhelm me. I closed my laptop and moved to the window, watching strangers navigate the slushy sidewalks below, all seemingly confident in their destinations. The city stretched before me, vast and indifferent to my personal crisis. I needed air. Grabbing my coat and Zoe's spare key, I headed out into the brisk November morning. The neighborhood was alive with activity, students rushing to class, professionals hurrying to offices, parents walking children to school. Everyone had somewhere to be, everyone but me. My feet carried me without conscious direction until I found myself at the entrance to Prospect Hill Park. I climbed to the top, where the Prospect Hill Monument stood as a testament to perseverance during the Siege of Boston. The view of the city from here was expansive, from the Prudential Tower to the Bunker Hill Monument, landmarks that had been the backdrop to my life, but now seemed to belong to a different world entirely. I sat on a bench, pulled out the small sketchbook I always carried, and began to draw. Not the cityscape before me, but the tumult within, jagged lines representing anger, spiraling curves for confusion, dark shading for fear. The act of creation had always been my way of processing emotions too complex for words, and today was no different. As I sketched, a memory surfaced, Professor Martinez from my creative writing class discussing how trauma shapes narrative. The story you tell about your life, she'd said, determines how you live it. Are you the victim? The hero? The observer? The choice is yours. What story was I telling myself now? Was I the abandoned daughter, cast out by unfeeling parents? The brave individualist, charting her own course against societal expectations? Or perhaps the foolish dreamer, unprepared for the harsh realities of independence? The question followed me as I left the park and wandered through the city streets. Cambridge welcomed me with its blend of historic architecture and modern commerce. Bookshops nestled beside tech startups, centuries-old churches alongside sleek apartment buildings. I found myself in Harvard Square, watching street performers brave the cold to entertain tourists with music and magic. One performer, an older man with weathered hands and kind eyes, played a haunting melody on a battered violin. His open case contained a few scattered bills and a cardboard sign. Music helped me survive. Maybe it will help you too. Something about his quiet dignity moved me. I dropped $1 into his case, money I could ill afford to give, and received a nod of acknowledgement that felt like benediction. As I turned to leave, he called out, "Sometimes the hardest journeys lead to the best destinations, young lady." I smiled in response, but his words echoed in my thoughts as I continued my aimless exploration. By mid-afternoon, hunger drove me to a small cafe where I nursed the cheapest item on the menu, a cup of tea for as long as I reasonably could while using the free Wi-Fi to search for affordable housing options. The results were discouraging. Boston's rental market was notoriously expensive, with even shared rooms in distant neighborhoods commanding prices beyond my means. Sublets and short-term rentals were similarly out of reach. I expanded my search to include house-sitting opportunities, work exchange arrangements, anything that might provide shelter without depleting my limited resources. A notification popped up on my phone, a text from Jessica. Mom and Dad told me what happened. Are you okay? Where are you? My finger hovered over the screen. Jessica had always been caught in the middle, the perfect daughter they wanted me to emulate, but also my sister who had, in her own way, tried to bridge the gap between us. I considered ignoring the message, severing one more tie to my old life, but something stopped me. I'm safe, I typed finally. Need some time. Please don't tell them where I am. Her reply came quickly, I won't. But if you need anything at all, I'm here. I put my phone away without responding, unsure whether her offer represented genuine support or another attempt to guide me back to the path my parents had chosen. Either way, I wasn't ready to accept help from anyone connected to the life I'd left behind. As evening approached, I made my way back to Zoe's apartment, stopping at a corner store to buy a cheap notebook and pens. If I was to rebuild my life, I needed to document the process, to capture the raw emotions and practical challenges of starting over. Perhaps someday these notes would become something more, an essay, a memoir, a warning to others contemplating similar leaps into the unknown. Zoe returned home exhausted from her 12-hour shift, but still found energy to help me brainstorm solutions. We spread takeout containers across her coffee table and made lists of possibilities on notebook paper. My cousin Ellie has a place in Jamaica Plain, she offered. She's looking for a roommate after her last one moved to Seattle. It's not fancy, but it's cheap by Boston standards. How cheap is cheap? I asked, wary of getting my hopes up. $700 for a bedroom with shared kitchen and bathroom. Utilities included. $700 was still more than half my savings, but it was better than I'd found on my own. I'd need to get a second job. Zoe nodded. Ellie works at that bookstore in Coolidge Corner. Maybe they're hiring? Or you could pick up some freelance illustration work. Your stuff is good, Sarah. Not good enough to pay rent, I said, the weight of reality dampening the momentary spark of optimism. Yet, Zoe countered firmly. Not good enough yet, but you could get there. We talked late into the night, mapping out various scenarios and contingency plans. By the time we finally went to sleep, me on the couch again, Zoe to her bedroom, we had cobbled together something resembling a plan. I would meet Ellie the next day, look at the room, and if it worked out, I would take it month by month while increasing my work hours and looking for additional income sources. It wasn't perfect, but it was a starting point. As I lay in the dark listening to the sounds of the city outside, I felt the first tendrils of hope taking root. The journey ahead would be difficult, lonely, and uncertain, but it was mine. Morning brought a text from Ellie confirming our meeting and another from my mother. Your father and I expect you to come home and discuss this situation like an adult. This behavior is childish and irresponsible. Reading it, I felt a flicker of doubt. Was I being childish? Was walking away from their support, however conditional it might be, a mistake I would come to regret? I thought of all the times I'd tried to explain my passion for art and writing, only to have it dismissed as a hobby, not a viable future. I recalled the constant comparisons to Jessica, the subtle and not-so-subtle reminders that I wasn't measuring up to their expectations. I remembered the look on their faces as they delivered their ultimatum, the absence of any attempt to understand what I wanted for myself. No, I wasn't being childish. I was finally, belatedly, claiming ownership of my life. The realization straightened my shoulders and lifted my chin as I prepared to meet Ellie and view what might become my first independent home. Jamaica Plain was a neighborhood I'd visited occasionally but never really explored. The area around the pond had always struck me as beautiful, with its mix of Victorian houses and contemporary developments, its diverse population and artistic vibe. Ellie's apartment was in a converted triple-decker a few blocks from the Green Street T station, its faded yellow paint peeling slightly around the windows. Ellie herself was nothing like Zoe, tall where Zoe was petite, reserved where Zoe was effusive, with a quiet intensity that made me slightly nervous as she showed me around the apartment. The room she offered was smaller than my bedroom at home, with just enough space for a twin bed, a small desk, and a narrow dresser. A single window overlooked the street, letting in weak November sunlight that couldn't quite dispel the room's shadow. Bathrooms shared, kitchen too, Ellie explained, leading me back to the common areas. I work weird hours at the bookstore and do most of my writing at night, so we probably won't get in each other's way much. You're a writer? I asked, noticing for the first time the bookshelves that lined the living room walls, crammed with volumes arranged not by author or genre, but by some organizational system I couldn't immediately discern. Ellie nodded, trying to be. Published a few short stories in literary journals no one reads. self-deprecation was matter-of-fact rather than fishing for reassurance. Zoe says you're into art? Illustration mainly, I replied, feeling oddly defensive about my own creative pursuits in the face of her published work, however limited its audience. Still figuring out if it's more than just a hobby. Aren't we all, Ellie said, with the ghost of a smile that made her seem suddenly more approachable. Want the room? I looked around the apartment again. Shabby but clean, impersonal but with potential, a blank canvas waiting to be filled with a new chapter of my life. Yes, I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. Yes, I do. We worked out the details over coffee at a nearby cafe. I would move in the following week, paying a security deposit and first month's rent from my savings. In the meantime, I would stay with Zoe, increase my hours at Groundworks if possible, and begin searching for a second job or freelance work to supplement my income. The first week in Ellie's apartment passed in a blur of exhaustion and adjustment. I had managed to increase my hours at Groundworks, picking up early morning shifts that left me bleary-eyed, but added precious dollars to my dwindling bank account. Ellie had also put in a good word for me at Trident Booksellers on Newberry Street, where I now worked 3 evenings a week shelving books and occasionally helping customers find what they were looking for. My new routine left little time for classes, but I was determined to finish the semester. I carried textbooks to work, reading during breaks and on the tee between jobs. Late at night, I'd sit at the small desk in my new room, the single lamp casting shadows as I typed essays or worked on projects, often hearing Ellie's quiet footsteps or the soft tapping of her keyboard from the living room where she preferred to write. We were ships passing in the night, exchanging brief pleasantries and updates on shared household items, but rarely having real conversations. Still, there was comfort in her presence, in knowing another human being was just on the other side of the wall as I navigated this strange new independence. December arrived with a vengeance, bringing bitter cold and the first major snowstorm of the season. The Jamaica Plain streets transformed overnight, buried under heavy drifts that made the walk to the T station a treacherous journey. My canvas sneakers, adequate for fall, proved woefully insufficient against the New England winter. Standing on the platform waiting for the train, my toes numb and cheeks stinging from the wind, I calculated how many hours of work it would take to afford proper winter boots. That was the reality of my new life. Every purchase, no matter how necessary, had to be weighed against hours of labor. Freedom had a price tag attached to every aspect, from the toothpaste I rationed to the meals I carefully planned to stretch my grocery budget. The privilege I'd taken for granted, hot water, heat, food in the refrigerator, now represented precious resources to be conserved and appreciated. The physical toll was considerable. Between 2 jobs and classes, I averaged 5 hours of sleep a night. My hands, once soft and nimble for drawing, grew chapped from washing coffee cups and shelving dusty books. Dark circles became permanent features under my eyes, and I lost weight I couldn't afford to lose, my clothes hanging looser with each passing week. One evening, as wet December snow fell outside the windows of Trident Bookstore, I was shelving new arrivals when my phone buzzed. Jessica again, another in her series of increasingly concerned texts that I'd been mostly ignoring. This one was different, though. Mom found your drawings online. The Etsy shop. She's furious that you've been hiding this from them. I stared at the screen, heart racing. My Etsy shop had been a secret project started 6 months ago, where I sold digital prints of my illustrations. It barely brought in enough to cover the cost of art supplies, but it had been mine, a small act of defiance and independence before I'd taken the larger leap of leaving home. As I contemplated how my mother had discovered it, probably by monitoring my social media, where I occasionally promoted new pieces, another text arrived. I think your work is really good, by the way. That series about urban solitude? It's powerful. I blinked back unexpected tears. Jessica had never commented on my art before, always too busy with her medical studies and residency to notice what her little sister was doing. This small validation, coming when I felt most alone, pierced through the wall I'd built around my emotions since leaving home. Thanks, I typed back, the first response I'd given her in days. It helps pay for ramen noodles at least. Are you eating enough? big sister concern evident even through text? I didn't answer that one. The truth that I'd been skipping meals to save money would only worry her, and worry might lead to intervention, which was the last thing I wanted. That night, lying in bed and listening to the radiator's irregular clanking, I found myself thinking about my parents' reaction to discovering my online shop. Their anger seemed so disproportionate, especially since I'd been selling my work, not just creating it for fun. Wasn't that what they wanted? Practical application of my interests? Or was the real issue that I'd found a way to pursue my passion without their approval or guidance? The questions followed me into uneasy dreams and lingered through my 5 a.m. shift at Groundworks the next morning. As I steamed milk and crafted lattes for sleepy commuters, I wrestled with a growing realization. My parents' rejection of my choices had never really been about practicality or security. It had been about control. Finals week arrived, bringing with it new levels of stress. I studied whenever I could, often on my feet behind the coffee counter during lulls or in the back room of the bookstore while on break. My illustration professor, Ms. Reeves, pulled me aside after I submitted my final project, a series of images depicting the emotional landscape of independence. "Sarah, this is some of your strongest work," she said, her eyes serious behind vintage cat eye glasses. "There's an authenticity here that wasn't present in your earlier assignments. But I'm concerned about you. You look exhausted." I mumbled something about end-of-semester stress, but Ms. Reeves wasn't easily deflected. "I've been teaching long enough to recognize when a student is struggling with more than academics," she said gently. "Is there something I can help with? The department has emergency funds for students in difficult situations." The kindness in her voice nearly undid me. For weeks, I'd been holding myself together through sheer force of will, refusing to acknowledge the difficulty of what I was attempting. Having someone see through that facade felt both terrifying and relieving. "I'm okay," I insisted, though my voice wavered. "Just adjusting to some life changes." She didn't press further, but handed me a business card. "This is the contact information for student services. They can connect you with resources, financial assistance, counseling, housing help. Promise me you'll call if things get too overwhelming." I tucked the card into my pocket and nodded, not trusting myself to speak. As I left the classroom, a mixture of emotions churned within me. Gratitude for her concern, shame at being so transparently in need, and stubborn pride that still resisted accepting help. The weekend before Christmas, Boston experienced its coldest day in years. The temperature plummeted to single digits, with wind chills well below zero. I had finally purchased winter boots, secondhand from a thrift store in Davis Square, but even they couldn't keep the cold at bay as I trudged through snowdrifts to get to work. Groundworks was nearly empty, most people sensibly staying home in the extreme weather. I was wiping down counters, counting the minutes until my shift ended, when a familiar figure walked through the door, Professor Martinez from my creative writing class. "Sarah," she said, unwinding a colorful scarf from around her neck. "I was hoping I'd find you here. Do you have a moment to talk?" She ordered a cappuccino and waited while I prepared it, then invited me to join her at a corner table during my break. Curious and slightly apprehensive, I sat across from her when my coworker agreed to cover the register for 15 minutes. "I wanted to discuss your final portfolio," Professor Martinez began, warming her hands around the coffee mug. "Your personal essay in particular. I had written about leaving home, about the fear and freedom of cutting ties with parental expectations. The assignment had been therapeutic, a way to process what I was experiencing, but I hadn't expected it to draw faculty attention. It's very good," she continued. "Raw, honest, compelling. The kind of writing that resonates because it comes from lived experience." "Thank you," I said, unsure where the conversation was heading. "I'm also the faculty advisor for the Beacon Literary Review," she explained, naming the college's respected literary magazine. "We're putting together our winter issue, and I'd like to include your essay, with your permission of." "Of course." I stared at her, certain I had misheard. "You want to publish my essay? In the Beacon?" She nodded. "We pay $300 for featured pieces. Not a fortune, but enough to acknowledge the value of your work." $300. almost half a month's rent. For words I had written in the small hours of the morning, hunched over my laptop as Ellie's cat wandered through the apartment. Yes, of course. Thank you, I stammered, unable to fully process what was happening. Professor Martinez smiled. Your writing has always shown promise, Sarah. But there's something different in this piece, an authenticity that can't be taught. Sometimes life's hardest moments become our most powerful material. As she left, promising to email me the details for publication, I sat in stunned silence. For months, I had been focused on survival, on the practical challenges of independence. I had set aside my creative aspirations as luxuries I couldn't afford, concentrating instead on minimum wage jobs and stretching every dollar. Yet here was a tangible validation of my work and, more importantly, of my voice. The essay that had earned recognition had come directly from the struggle I was living, the very experience my parents had dismissed as irresponsible and childish. Christmas came and went with little fanfare in my new life. Ellie had gone to her parents' home in New Hampshire, leaving me alone in the apartment with her cat, Dostoevsky, Dost for short, who regarded me with the suspicious tolerance of a creature accustomed to better caretakers. The bookstore was closed for 2 days, but Groundworks remained open with reduced hours, catering to those who, like me, had nowhere else to be during the holiday. I received a package from Jessica, a pair of high-quality thermal gloves, a sketchbook, and a gift card to the art supply store near my old community college. The thoughtfulness of her gifts, so perfectly aligned with my needs and interests, brought tears to my eyes as I sat alone in the quiet apartment on Christmas morning. I texted her a thank you, careful to maintain the boundary I'd established by not sharing details about my new living situation. My parents said nothing, their silence a statement louder than any words could have been. Despite my resolve to forge my own path, their absence during the holiday season left an ache that no amount of independence could quite heal. I found myself thinking of Christmases past, the smell of Mom's gingerbread cookies, the way Dad would insist on wearing a ridiculous light-up sweater while we opened presents, the familiar traditions that had shaped my understanding of family and belonging. The week between Christmas and New Year's passed in a haze of extra shifts and quiet evenings spent drawing or reading. Boston felt subdued, as if the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for the fresh start a new year promised. I used the solitude to reflect on the rapid changes of the past month, taking stock of what I'd lost and gained in my abrupt transition to independence. On New Year's Eve, I worked the closing shift at Groundworks, serving peppermint mochas to revelers preparing for midnight celebrations. By the time I locked up and began the long, cold walk home, snow was falling, not the harsh, driving flakes of December storms, but gentle, floating crystals that caught the streetlights like tiny stars. I was halfway to the T station when my phone rang. The sound startled me. Few people called rather than texted, and fewer still would call at 11 p.m. on New Year's Eve. The screen displayed Mom's Cell, a name I hadn't seen since the day I left. My finger hovered over the decline button. Part of me wanted to let it go to voicemail, to preserve the fragile peace I'd constructed in my new life. But curiosity, or perhaps some lingering thread of attachment, made me answer. Hello? My voice sounded strange to my own ears, tentative and slightly breathless. Sarah, my mother's voice was equally unfamiliar, strained and hesitant, nothing like her usual confident tone. Sarah, thank God you answered. What's wrong? I asked, immediately alert to the distress in her voice. It's your father, she said, the words coming in a rush. He's in the hospital, Boston Medical Center. They're saying he might have had a heart attack. The world seemed to tilt beneath my feet, forcing me to grab a nearby railing for support. What? When? This afternoon. He was shoveling the driveway and just collapsed. Her voice broke on the last word. I've been trying to reach you for hours. I hadn't checked my phone during my shift. Groundworks had strict policies about personal device use while on the clock. How's he now? Stable, they say. They're running tests. They want to keep him overnight at least. There was a pause, filled with the sound of her uneven breathing. Sarah, I know things have been difficult between us, but your father kept asking for you when he regained consciousness. worried he might not get a chance to make things right. The words hit me with physical force, making my chest tighten. For weeks, I'd been nurturing my anger, using it as fuel to push forward in my new life. I'd rehearsed arguments and justifications, preparing for an eventual confrontation where I would finally make them understand how deeply they had hurt me. Never once had I considered that time for such reconciliation might not be guaranteed. "I'll be there," I said, the decision making itself. "Which floor?" "Cardiology, 4th floor, room 412. The relief in her voice was palpable. "Thank you, Sarah." I ended the call and changed direction, heading not toward Jamaica Plain, but to the nearest entrance to the Red Line. Boston Medical Center was a short distance from Broadway Station, a ride I'd made countless times during my childhood when we would visit my grandmother before she passed away. The familiar route now felt surreal, as if I were moving through a dream landscape. The hospital was busy despite the holiday, the emergency room filled with the usual array of accidents and ailments that accompany New Year's Eve festivities. I navigated the halls with muscle memory, finding the elevator that would take me to the cardiology floor. Each step seemed both automatic and impossibly difficult, carrying me toward a reunion I had neither planned for nor prepared. Room 412 was like any other hospital room, stark, functional, filled with the quiet beeping of monitoring equipment. My father lay in the bed, looking smaller somehow, vulnerable in a way I'd never associated with him. My mother sat beside him, her hand clutching his, her face showing every hour of worry she'd endured. They both looked up as I entered there, expressions a complex mix of relief, apprehension, and something I couldn't quite identify. For a long moment, none of us spoke, the weight of our last encounter hanging heavily in the sterile air. "Sarah," my father finally said, his voice rough. "You came." The simple acknowledgement broke something inside me. I moved to the bedside, conscious of the cables and tubes connecting him to various machines. "Of course I came." My mother stood, hesitated, then embraced me with a fierceness that took me by surprise. "I'm sorry," she whispered against my hair. "We're both so sorry." I didn't know how to respond to this unexpected vulnerability, this admission that had seemed impossible just weeks ago. Instead, I asked about my father's condition, about the doctor's assessments and treatment plans. The medical details provided safe ground, a neutral territory where we could meet without immediately confronting the emotional chasm between us. As I listened to their account of the day's events, I studied my parents with new eyes. They looked older than when I'd left, the strain of recent weeks etched into the lines around their eyes and mouths. My father's hair seemed grayer, my mother's shoulders more stooped. Had they always been this fragile and I'd simply never noticed? Or had my absence accelerated a decline that was already underway? "They think it was just a warning," my father explained, gesturing to the machines monitoring his heart. "Not a full attack, but what they call angina. Severe chest pain caused by reduced blood flow to the heart." It was terrifying, my mother added, her usual composure cracking. One minute he was fine, the next he was on the ground, clutching his chest. I really thought I was losing him. My father reached for her hand, a gesture of comfort that seemed out of character for the stern, reserved man I knew. "The doctor says I need to make some lifestyle changes. Less stress, better diet, more rest. He's been working too hard," my mother said, looking at me directly for the first time. "We both have. Ever since you left, we've been." She trailed off, unable or unwilling to articulate exactly what they'd been. Worried sick, my father supplied. Angry, confused, hurt. Take your pick. The honesty was startling. My parents had always maintained a certain emotional distance, presenting a united front of practical concerns and logical arguments rather than raw feelings. This new vulnerability felt like unfamiliar territory for all of us. "I didn't leave to hurt you," I said finally, the words I'd rehearsed so many times in my head now sounding inadequate in the face of their genuine distress. "I left because I needed to find out who I am without your expectations shaping every decision I make." My father's expression softened. "We never meant to make you feel trapped, Sarah. We just wanted to protect you from the struggles we faced, to give you a clearer path than we had. By pushing me toward a life I never wanted, The question came out sharper than I intended, old pain flaring despite my best efforts to contain it. We thought we knew what was best, my mother admitted, her voice small. We were wrong. These past weeks without you, they've given us a lot of time to think about how we've been treating you. Comparing you to Jessica, dismissing your interests, not really seeing you for who you are. I swallowed hard, unprepared for this acknowledgement that addressed the very core of my grievances. I needed you to believe in me, not just in the version of me you wanted me to become. I do believe in you, my father said, surprising me. I always have. I was afraid for you. The art world is so competitive, so uncertain. I didn't want to see you struggle the way my brother did, chasing dreams that never materialized, always one gig away from financial disaster. This revelation startled me. I knew vaguely of Uncle Michael, my father's younger brother who had moved to California before I was born, but he was rarely mentioned in our home. Your brother? The one in Los Angeles. My father nodded. Michael was brilliant, far more talented than I ever was. He went west to become a screenwriter, convinced he'd be the next big thing in Hollywood. 40 years later, he's still picking up whatever writing jobs he can find, living in a tiny apartment, no retirement savings, no security. You never told me that, I said, understanding dawning. You never explained why you were so opposed to creative careers. We should have, my mother acknowledged. We should have talked to you about our fears instead of just imposing rules and expectations. We wanted to shield you from disappointment, but instead, we became the source of it. The new year arrived while we were still talking in that hospital room, the distant sounds of celebration barely registering as we navigated years of misunderstanding and hurt. When a nurse came in to check my father's vitals at 12:30 a.m., she seemed surprised to find us deep in conversation, tissues crumpled in our hands and decades of unspoken feelings finally finding voice. Happy New Year, she said, smiling as she adjusted my father's form. Starting fresh with family, that's the best way to begin. Her words hung in the air after she left, a simple observation that captured the complexity of what was happening between us. Were we starting fresh? Could we, after everything that had happened? The question followed me back to Jamaica Plain in the early hours of the morning, accompanied by my mother's tear-stained face and my father's gruff but sincere request, come home when they release me tomorrow. Just to talk. No pressure beyond that. I had agreed, more out of emotional exhaustion than conviction. As I unlocked the door to Ellie's apartment, Dost greeting me with an indignant meow at the lateness of his breakfast, I felt both drained and strangely lightened, as if some invisible burden had shifted during those hours of honest conversation. The next day, I returned to the hospital for my father's discharge, watching as the doctor explained his new medication regimen and dietary restrictions. My mother took meticulous notes, her hand trembling slightly as she wrote down instructions for cardiac care and follow-up appointments. I'll drive, I offered as we helped my father into his coat, noting how my mother's eyes widened with surprise at this small gesture of support. The ride to Winchester was quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts as familiar landmarks appeared along the route. The Middlesex Fells Reservation, where we used to hike on Sunday afternoons, the ice cream shop where we celebrated my high school graduation, the public library where I'd spent countless hours discovering books that would shape my view of the world. Our house looked exactly as I remembered, the colonial-style facade with its faded blue paint and white trim standing solid against the winter backdrop. Yet it felt different somehow, transformed by my absence and return into something both intimate and foreign. Inside, the familiar smells of home, my mother's lavender sachets, the old wood floors, the lingering scent of pine from the Christmas tree still standing in the corner of the living room, washed over me with unexpected force. I helped settle my father in his recliner, noticing for the first time the family photos that adorned the walls and shelves. So many captured moments of our lives together, yet the recent ones primarily featured Jessica, her graduation, her white coat ceremony, her engagement to Mark. My absence from these newer milestones was palpable, a visual representation of how I had begun to fade from the family narrative even before I physically left. The realization stirred a complex mix of emotions, sadness for what had been lost, anger at being pushed come back eventually. I didn't know how to respond to this admission, this evidence that despite everything, she had maintained a space for me in this home. Instead, I moved toward the kitchen, falling back on practicality. I'll make some tea. Dad needs to stay hydrated with his new medication. As I filled the kettle, familiar motions in a familiar space, my mother joined me, her presence tentative. Sarah, before your father comes in, I want you to know that we've been reading your published essay, the one in the Beacon. I nearly dropped the kettle. How did you? Jessica told us, she explained. She saw it online and thought we should read it. She was right. The thought of my parents reading those raw, honest words, my hurt, my anger, my struggle to define myself apart from their expectations, made my chest tighten with anxiety. And it was painful, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. To see ourselves through your eyes. To understand how deeply we'd hurt you without even realizing it. But it was also illuminating. You're an incredible writer, Sarah. The way you captured the feeling of being suffocated by others' expectations, it resonated with me more than I'd like to admit. I stared at her, trying to reconcile this vulnerable, reflective woman with the unyielding mother who had thrown my clothes at me just weeks ago. What do you mean? She sighed, leaning against the counter. I never told you this, but I wanted to be a teacher. Not a corporate accountant, not the practical career path my parents insisted upon. I loved literature, wanted to share that passion with young minds. But my parents, they were immigrants who had sacrificed everything for my opportunities. How could I dishonor that sacrifice by choosing a lower-paying profession? This revelation stunned me. In all our years together, she had never mentioned this dream, this parallel to my own struggle. You gave up what you wanted for what they wanted. She nodded, eyes distant with old memories. And then I did the same thing to you, without even realizing the pattern I was repeating. Reading your essay, it was like looking in a mirror and seeing my younger self reflected back at me, only this time, I was the one casting the shadow. The kettle whistled, breaking the moment. As I prepared the tea, my thoughts raced, trying to integrate this new understanding of my mother with the years of conflict between us. We carried the steaming mugs to the living room, where my father was flipping through a photo album, his expression thoughtful. Remember this? He asked as we entered, pointing to a photograph of me at perhaps 8 years old, face smeared with paint, grinning wildly at the camera. Your first art class at the community center. You came home covered in primary colors and announced you were going to be the most famous artist in the universe. The memory was fuzzy but present, the excitement of creating, the pride in showing my parents the abstract painting I'd made, the absolute certainty of my artistic destiny. I'd forgotten about that. I hadn't, he said quietly. That's why your mother and I put you in art classes every summer, bought you those expensive colored pencils for your birthdays. We were proud of your talent, Sarah. Somewhere along the way, we just lost sight of what really mattered. Which was what? I asked, setting his tea on the side table. Your happiness, my mother answered simply. Not some prescribed definition of success, not financial security above all else. Just you, finding joy in what you do, becoming the person you're meant to be. The words I had longed to hear for so long now hung in the air between us, a bridge beginning to form across the chasm of misunderstanding. Yet doubts still lingered, years of conditional approval not easily forgotten. How do I know this isn't just because of Dad's health scare? That once the crisis passes, you won't revert to pressuring me about real careers and practical choices. My father shifted in his chair, wincing slightly at what might have been a twinge of chest pain. We can't erase the past, Sarah, or promise we'll never worry about your future. But what happened to me? It puts things in perspective. Life is too short and too fragile to sacrifice relationships on the altar of being right. We're asking for a chance, my mother added, reaching for my hand. Not for you to move back home or abandon the independence you fought for. Just a chance to rebuild, to get to know each other again as the people we actually are, not the roles we've been playing. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft flakes drifting past the windows as afternoon faded toward evening. I sipped my tea, considering their words, weighing the risk of renewed hurt against the possibility of healing. The family I'd left behind and the independence independent life I'd begun seemed suddenly not as mutually exclusive as I had thought, but rather different facets of a more complex whole. I can't go back to how things were, I said finally. I won't give up my apartment or my jobs or my classes. And I need you to respect my choices, even when you don't understand or agree with them. We can do that, my father said, a new humility in his voice that I had never heard before. We're learning, Sarah. Slowly, maybe, but we're trying. And we're proud of you, my mother added. Not despite your choices, but because of them. The courage it took to leave, to build a life on your own terms, that's something. To admire, not condemn. The admission brought unexpected tears to my eyes. Pride, real pride, not contingent on following a prescribed path, was what I had craved from them all along. This simple acknowledgement felt like water after a long drought, nourishing parts of me that had begun to wither. As evening deepened, we talked more about my apartment in Jamaica Plain, about Ellie and her writing, about my jobs and classes, and the publication in the Beacon. I showed them photos on my phone of my new life, the small spaces and modest achievements that represented such enormous growth for me. They listened with genuine interest, asking questions that reflected a desire to understand rather than judge. When it was time for me to leave, I had an early shift at Groundworks the next morning. My mother packed leftovers from dinner in containers, a familiar gesture that now felt like acceptance rather than obligation. My father hugged me at the door, his embrace gentler than before, but no less meaningful. This isn't fixed in one day, he acknowledged, his voice rough with emotion. But it's a start. I nodded against his shoulder, allowing myself to feel the comfort of his arms around me, to acknowledge the love that had always been there, however imperfectly expressed. A start is enough for now. Driving back to Jamaica Plain, I felt a curious sense of expansiveness, as if my world had suddenly grown larger. The independent life I had built remained mine, hard-won and precious. But alongside it now existed the possibility of a new relationship with my family, one built on mutual respect and understanding rather than expectation and disappointment. The new year stretched before me, full of both challenges and opportunities. I would continue to work my demanding jobs, to attend classes, to develop my creative voice through writing and illustration. The financial struggles and physical exhaustion of independence wouldn't magically disappear, but perhaps the emotional burden would be lighter, knowing that I was no longer completely alone in my journey. Ellie was still awake when I returned, typing at her laptop in the dim light of the living room. She looked up as I entered, her keen eyes taking in what must have been a complex mix of emotions on my face. Family reconciliation, she asked with the directness I had come to appreciate about her. Something like that, I replied, sinking onto the couch beside her. A beginning, at least. She nodded, understanding without needing details. Beginnings are tricky, full of potential, but also uncertainty. No guarantees about how the story ends. I know, I said, thinking of all the beginnings I had navigated in recent weeks. New home, new jobs, new independence, and now this fragile new connection with my parents. But I think that's life, isn't it? A series of beginnings, each one changing the shape of what follows. Ellie smiled, a rare, full smile that transformed her serious face. Sounds like something a writer would say, she observed, turning back to her laptop. You might be one of us after all. The casual comment settled over me like a warm blanket. One of us, a creator, a storyteller, someone who made meaning from experience. It was an identity I was slowly growing into, learning to claim without apology or justification. Later, in the quiet of my small room, I opened my sketchbook and began to draw. Not the anger and isolation that had fueled my earlier work, but something more nuanced, a scene from the day's visit. My father in his recliner, my mother beside him, our faces caught in a moment of vulnerability and hope. The illustration captured something words alone could not express, the complicated, imperfect, essential bonds of family, the wounds that might never fully heal but could perhaps become less painful with time and understanding. As my pencil moved across the paper, I realized I was no longer simply documenting my journey or processing my pain. I was creating something new from the raw material of my experiences, transforming struggle into art, confusion into clarity. This, I understood now, was the true price and reward of freedom, not just the practical challenges of independence, but the deeper responsibility of authoring my own life story, with all its complexity and contradiction. The snow continued to fall outside my window, covering the city in a clean white blanket that would, come morning, reveal the paths of those who dared to venture out into the new day. Like them, I would leave my own tracks in this uncharted territory, not following anyone else's footsteps, but creating my own way forward, connected to my past, but no longer defined by it, author and protagonist of a story still unfolding.